There we go. I think we've started
All right.
now.
So if you share the screen again.
Yeah, I'll reshare the screen. If you can just put in the chat if you can hear and see us, that would be great. Share the screen for Tony.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks for letting us know. Hi. Morning, Zonica. Let us know whereabouts you are. Whereabouts in Jamaica? I'm guessing
Jamaica.
most of you in Jamaica. Occasionally we have interlopers that find out about these things.
Can you see the screen now, Tony?
Yeah, I know, Zonica. Which bit of Jamaica? I can see the screen. Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Alice. Whereabouts in Jamaica? Whereabouts in Jamaica, Ayana? I know you're all in Jamaica. I wish I was.
Well, welcome everyone. Hopefully, a few
Hi,
people start to join as the few minutes go on. I'm Alice from Macmillan Education, and obviously, hopefully, some of you may have met in person or had a webinar or training session with Dr. Tony Cotton before this. So we're very lucky to have him here today to do a session on making mathematics relevant and enjoyable for students. So yes, please use the chat, ask questions as the session goes on. I can answer a few on the messaging and stop Tony if necessary, and obviously he can see the chat too. So please do use that to make it as interactive as possible. A few things also to mention is everyone will get a certificate for their professional development at the end of the session, and also I'll be sharing the slides. And there's also a link to a form, a feedback form. We really value that. So if you can enter answer some questions at the end, that would be really great. And the only other thing is, which I mentioned again at the end, is if any of your colleagues aren't able to join today, we'll be showing around a register your interest for watching the recording, and your colleagues will still be able to get their certificate if they register through that form. So I think they're most of the key things just wanted to let everyone know before I hand over to Tony. And yeah, thank you very much, Tony. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Unusually, it's 31 degrees in a place called Otley, which is in the north of England, where I'm joining you from. I wish I was with you. I wish I was actually in Jamaica. I was there. I think it was February time. I noticed a few of you are from Mandeville. I came to Mandeville as part of that trip. And I was entertained to see that, or interested to see that Manchester High School was in Mandeville. Three of my grandsons, who are actually staying with me at the moment, it's the midterm break here at the moment, live near Manchester, UK. We haven't got a Mandeville, but we do have a Manchester, and they were excited that there was a Manchester in Jamaica. Hi, David. I've heard that St. Elizabeth is the best. I was talking to a really good friend of mine last Wednesday. He's the only friend I still have from school. And we realized that the first gig that we ever went to was almost exactly 50 years ago. And he has visited St. Elizabeth twice. So what I'm really hoping is that I've actually been out to Jamaica 3 times now. I'm hoping there'll be a 4th visit next year, and that I'll be able to. I was in Kingston and New Kingston and Mandeville earlier in the year, and I'm hoping I'll visit places like St. Elizabeth and Spanish Town and St. Catherine on that journey. I've got a lot to see. The only problem with that visit is it's hugely increased my spending on reggae vinyl. I fell back in love with reggae. Well, I've never fallen out of love, but I kind of caught back up with what's going on in terms of reggae and dancehall and lovers rock at the moment. And so I'm buying too many records, according to my wife. So we agreed with Kingston Bookshop, who looked after me incredibly well on the face-to-face tour, that I'd run a webinar, which will be an hour, another 55 minutes. And it was met with, at that time we were thinking it would be mainly for people who'd not been able to get to the face-to-face sessions. Obviously, there's still a lot of rebuilding going on in terms of what was hit by the hurricane. So we couldn't visit as many places as we wanted. As I was planning, I actually realized that probably several of you, or more than several of you, will have been at the face-to-face sessions. And like I say hi in the chat if you were at the face-to-face sessions, and let me know which one you were in. So I then started to think, well, what would be relevant for all teachers in Jamaica, all primary teachers in Jamaica? And did a bit of research. I did quite a lot of teaching around the world, and so I was kind of interested in what was important for globally in terms of mathematics education. And as I researched the concerns around the world, around the globe, the question that was most engaging teachers and academics globally was the one that I'm trying to think about today, think about the next hour, which is how we make mathematics relevant and enjoyable for students. And as I say that, part of me thinks there's something there about making mathematics relevant and enjoyable for us. Okay, for us teachers who are working with kids. So there's something there about thinking about the amount of control we have over what we teach and how we can make sure that we make that enjoyable and relevant. I'd been running a webinar for a couple of years around, and I call it in the UK, the joy of teaching mathematics. That was because in the UK, we've been doing okay in the international comparisons. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been getting a little bit better. So gradually, ever so slowly, moving up the league tables, if you like, in terms of achievement in mathematics. What we haven't been doing very well in the UK is thinking about the topic I'm going to talk about now. So when students were asked, did they enjoy mathematics? Did they look forward to going to mathematics lessons? And when teachers were asked the same question, we've actually in the UK been going down that league table. So even though we're slightly increasing in terms of achievement in exams, we're getting worse in terms of people feeling good about doing mathematics and about it being relevant. Now you might think, why would that be a problem? If the kids are passing exams, that's fine. I think if kids are passing exams but not seeing mathematics as relevant and not enjoying the process of learning mathematics in school, that they will not be using that mathematics outside school. They see the mathematics as located in the schoolroom, and they don't enjoy it, so they want to forget all about ever doing mathematics again once they've left school. I bet some of you, when you finished your final maths exam in your high school, said to your friends, thank goodness I never have to do maths ever again. Now, we don't want that. That's what we don't want. We want people enjoying the experience and therefore using mathematics to take control of their life. Because if we do use mathematics outside school, we're much more able to take controls of our lives. Those of you who came to see me face to face know that I tend to use quite a lot of examples from observing children. My picture's quite small on the screen, so you may not be able to see quite how old a man I am. So I've been doing this for quite a long time. The joy of being 67 is that I get to observe small children growing up with mathematics, and I get to observe them closely. And I'm talking about my grandchildren. And I never had that luxury when I was a teacher. One of the things that I say in every session that I teach is, if you only do one thing, the next time you teach a mathematics lesson later today. I know we're before school, aren't we, in Jamaica? Give yourself 5 minutes. I'll tell you what, I'll make it easier. Give yourself 2 minutes. Stand somewhere in your teaching space where you're not obvious to the students and just watch them and listen to them for 2 minutes. And that will give you more information about what they're learning and what they're understanding than any amount of testing that you do. I think you're right, Brian. I think everything we do is math. And I've now got 7 grandchildren. I recently, I was going to say, came into possession of, obviously they're not my possessions, to a pair of twins. Two twins, that my middle son and his wife. Actually, they're in the process of adopting these twins. And watching them from the age of 3 weeks with thinking about mathematics, because my first visit to them, I was doing a session for some university students, a day session. And I realized that we first see the world through mathematics. We don't have language at that stage. At 3 weeks, we're not really even making many sounds apart from crying when we need changing or when we need food. Okay, so that's that form of communication. But in that early development, what we are doing, or what I notice the twins doing, is noticing repetitions, noticing repetitive behaviors of these people that they don't yet know are their parents. Okay, they just happen to be, I don't know, how do we know what people are thinking when they're 3 weeks old? But they do notice that repetition, so they know that the cry of communication might lead to a bottle, which leads to a feeling of satisfaction. They're starting to notice light and shade. They're starting to notice how facial expressions match a particular feeling, and they'll start to copy that. Now, repetition, patterns, colours, noticing all of those things and understanding what comes with that pattern is mathematics. Okay, it's understanding pattern. It's very early mathematics. So I'm now convinced that we are mathematical before we are linguistic. And I'm going to carry on thinking about that. That's the thing that I've been thinking about most quite recently. Tomorrow I'm going to go, I'm back seeing the twins again. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So my claim there is that mathematics is relevant and enjoyable from birth. So maybe our aim as teachers is to try and avoid making mathematics irrelevant and not enjoyable. Now, we don't do that on purpose, but sometimes constraints that are placed on us may make us work in a way that maybe does make it irrelevant and not enjoyable, both for the students and for us. And I think the other thing around enjoyment is it leading to confidence, which is the opposite of having an exam and saying, I don't ever want to do mathematics again. We're not confident in our mathematical skills if that's what we're saying. If we're enjoying mathematics, we become confident with mathematics. Another little example there in terms of confidence. Tate, who's staying with us at the moment, is 8. He's a very good mathematician. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. He certainly enjoys it, and he's certainly very, very confident around it. He had a school report about 6 months ago, and he looked at the report, and the grades were a 1 if you were exceeding expectations, a 2 if you were meeting expectations, and a 3 if you were working towards the expected level, which is the system in the UK. And Tate looked at the report, saw his 2 for maths, and just said, I'm better than 2. And you know what, he is. But I think, and again, this isn't in the slightest to blame his teachers. I think his teachers are that they do understand him, and they really support him. But I think the only grade that was probably available because of the way that they experienced Tate's mathematics was a 2. Because what they don't get is the view of Tate when he teaches himself the 24-hour clock, which he did 2 years ago when he was 6. He hadn't met the 24-hour clock at school. But because there were clocks around the rooms at home, he just said one day, "Grandad, it says 18. That's the same as 6 o'clock because you just take 12 off." So he taught himself that. Now he won't have had a chance to say to his teachers at school that he's done that, but he's confident enough to be able to think, okay, well that might come later. So it's building that sort of confidence. Morning, Samantha. Thanks for joining us. Morning, Michelle. And thanks, Vanessa. Let's move on a slide, Alice. I think 16 minutes on slide 1 will probably do. You will have understood, those of you who came to my face-to-face, that what this isn't is me reading through the slides, and we'll see how far we get. All the slides will exist, and I'll quickly whiz through if we don't get through all of them, so that you know what it was that I was going to say. Some of you will have met me. One of the things that I think is really important in terms of our teaching mathematics is that and making it relevant and enjoyable, is that we are human in the classroom, that we are actually the person in the classroom that we would like people to see outside of the classroom. A friend of mine, colleague of mine, who carried out her PhD study alongside me, a woman called Hilary Povey. We were all maths educators at the same time doing PhDs. A woman called Jo Bowler was another in that group, who's now quite famous and works in the States at Stanford. Hilary talked about familial relationships in the classroom, that the classrooms which are most effective in terms of teaching mathematics are the classrooms which have a familial feel. Okay. And those of you that are parents, those of you that have young people that you know and love outside school, know that doesn't mean letting people get away with not doing anything. It's not a soft option, but it is to do with actually making things relevant and enjoyable, because we want to build that confidence. And a lot of you will probably have had kids say to you accidentally "mum" or "dad" at some stage. Yeah, like I say, I'm now at the stage where kids refer to me as granddad rather than mum or dad in the classroom. So there's a little bit about me. The picture top left is family Christmas. Family is hugely important to me. Adam and Rachel on the left-hand side. Helen decided to buy everybody the same jumper for Christmas, which they're all wearing. Are the ones who've just recently adopted twins. Holly and Ben. Holly's our eldest daughter on the right-hand side. You can just about see Tate in the picture. He's standing in front of his mum. He's got a full face cycling helmet on, so he's kind of disappeared into his mother's chest. Quinny is looking nervous. He got some Wellingtons for Christmas, which he's wearing. It was very cold. It wasn't wet. And Felix are their 3 children with his Christmas jumper on. The man in the middle is kind of an adoptive son called Tanda. He lives in the UK now, from South Africa, from Durban in South Africa, an incredibly talented jazz musician. And you will also see 2 dogs. My daughter is a dog groomer, which I will talk about a little bit later on. And those 3 boys particularly have taught me a lot about mathematics. The other thing that's really important to me is music. We took Felix in the middle. I'm from Leeds in the north of England. I was brought up in Liverpool from the age of 2, and that's a statue of the Beatles on the Pierhead at Liverpool. Liverpool and Jamaica, obviously the UK and Jamaica, closely connected, and I talked about that quite a lot at the face-to-face. I'll talk about that less this time, but I think one of the things I've learned through these sessions and through writing the books for Jamaica is how closely our histories are linked, and kind of, for me, the responsibility we bear for a lot of Jamaica's still recent history. Then another music icon, bottom right, that was at the trip over in February. Wonderful place. Got a chance to visit the Bob Marley Museum. And the photograph above, one of the other things that I've been lucky enough to do is work in Belize. So as well as writing textbooks and mathematical textbooks for Jamaica and other countries, I've written the primary textbooks that all primary schools in Belize use. And that lovely group of people are a group of Belizean teachers who are gradually taking over the training from me, so that I unfortunately get to go less, but they very fortunately get to work with all of their teachers on implementing their new curriculum. So that's a little bit about me. And I always use that phrase. So I am still a mathematics teacher. We'll probably do some mathematics teaching now later, as well as teaching teachers of mathematics. I think in order for us to make mathematics enjoyable for students, we need to enjoy doing mathematics ourselves. So it's kind of modeling mathematics that is enjoyable for us to work on with our students. And that the way that we understand mathematics impacts on the way that we understand the world. And that certainly doesn't happen if we're not confident in mathematics. That gets in the way of understanding the world, or we try and avoid doing mathematics. That gets in the way of understanding the world too. Okay, next slide, please, Alice. I showed this slideshow to Tate and Quinn and Holly. They were all happy with these pictures being included. And I wanted to think about this idea of joy in learning. I talked about dog grooming when I was with you in February, end of January, beginning of February. It's an unusual thing, but Holly is very skilled, and she's just won competitions at the weekend. She travels Europe at the moment, but she's actually going to Canada to compete in July. And she's learned how to do that. So there are courses that you go on. There are books that you read. She is now qualified enough to teach dog grooming. And maybe one of the things about joy in learning is that grin. She's obviously enjoyed applying what she's learned to grooming a dog. And there are a whole range of skills, using different scissors, using different razors. You have to create that little fluffy cloud thing. It involves bathing in certain ways and blow drying in certain ways. And the idea is to get the dog to look as much like the standard groom as you can. So she's applying all of these skills that she's learned in order to be successful. The middle photograph is very recent. That's a week old. That's Tate. Tate is 6, and he's making some Lego. Okay, he's creating Lego, and the Lego, it's around the World Cup, the current World Cup that's coming up. When Tate's really concentrating hard, his tongue comes out. Can you see that? And you'll have seen those sorts of things in kids that you teach as well, in students that you teach as well. When the tongue comes out when they start to concentrate. Those of you that came to the sessions know that I'm autistic, and one of the things that some autistic people do when you ask them a question or when you ask them to think about something is look away, like I just have then. Okay. And what they're doing is moving, again, not looking at your face, which will be a distraction, and not looking at anything that they can see in front of them, which is a distraction, and just trying to look at the ceiling so they can think, so they can remove all distractions. And I think probably Tate sticking his tongue out there is a way of noticing his tongue sticking out in order to remove other distractions. The Lego kit he's building is really quite complicated. We've not finished it yet. He's been working on it for a couple of hours, not all at the same time. There are 5 packets of pieces. There are over 1,000 pieces to put together, and really quite complicated instructions to follow. So all sorts of mathematics going on, and he's most certainly enjoying it, as well as learning things about how to follow instructions, how to classify pieces, because we need to describe the pieces to each other. A green fourer, meaning it's got 4 dots on the top. A green eta with a curve. So you have to find ways of describing things that we're looking for. And on the right hand side is Tate. He's now 9. And that's a presentation that he did to the school and to all the parents about Egyptian artifacts. So he created artifacts and was giving kind of an academic talk about them. And he will completely focus on the task in hand. We think Tate's autistic, and one of his skills that he gets through his autism is an absolute focus on a task that he wants to do. And one of the things that was quite entertaining about watching Tate present so there were 3 9-year-olds all presenting about Egyptian gods, and Tate had learnt everybody's little speech. So was mouthing the speeches for the other 2 kids before he started his. And he still talks about that as something that he really, really enjoyed doing. And so, I mean, there's different sorts of relevancies there as well, isn't there? So there's something about relevance and football, and that's what Quinn's interested in. Lego is something he's seen particularly his big brother Felix working on, so he wants to be like his big brother. Relevance, the Egyptians might not be directly relevant to Tate, but going to museums is something he's done with his family. Making presentations is something he sees his granddad do. Holly loves dogs, so that's immediately relevant to us. So we can kind of create relevance in different areas. One last slide. So the next slide, please, Alice. And that's Tanda again. That's a more typical summer, and that's actually in Manchester. MJF stands for Manchester Jazz Festival, Manchester in the north of England. And you can just about see the blue umbrella at the front. It's raining. That was 2 weeks ago. And what Tanda is doing there is, as part of his jazz performance, he's teaching a group of school children a particular African jazz standard. Okay. And again, there was joy in their faces about working on a South African Zulu jazz standard. And again, things we might not immediately think were relevant, but it was directly relevant to their experience. And I guess it's the enjoyment of singing, the enjoyment of joining in, being part of a bigger group, and maybe feeling that success. So I'd like to invite you to think of a time when you had joy in learning, just briefly, and maybe jot something in the chat about a time when you enjoyed learning. It may well not be in school. It may be in school. It may be a time that you can remember from school. Gives me a chance to have a drink of water. Good morning, Monique. Thanks for coming. Hi, Radcliffe. I'm going to sit and wait until somebody comes in. So a time when you enjoyed learning. Maybe just type the thing that you enjoyed. Okay, talk a bit more about that then, Shanae. So a little bit more about that memorable moment and what made it enjoyable. Thanks, Sonia. I'll come back to that in a minute. And I'm interested that Sonia's example is something where we were active. It was in the classroom, so it's directly relevant. We're actually having some tiles in a kitchen at the moment, so we had to literally count tiles to work out how many to buy. Same for you, Kristen. Talk about what it was about that moment that made it particularly memorable. That's quite a nice way of rephrasing the memorable. Thanks, Aunt Wayne. Do people call you Aunt Wayne? I'm Aunt to the family, and I'm Tony when I'm playing atoms to learn multiplication. Thanks, Linton. Yeah, we learn a lot from kids, don't we? Yeah. So when we meet, Aunt, we can say hi, Aunt. So I'm Tony when I write books, and I'm Aunt for the rest of the family. Okay. Thanks, Tiana. And can you see how the relevant isn't necessarily just to do with it being practical, although building a house is. So Vanessa is talking about using algebra tiles to show completing the square. So there's something mathematical in that. Shanae being rewarded, quiz on algebra, get the answer right. So you will have gained confidence in that as well, Shanae. We kind of have to push on through, don't we? Push on through that nervousness and feel supported enough by our teacher so that we'll give it a go. Oh, I love that, Ambrosia. I'm going to read that for everybody. I enjoyed when the teacher would take us outside for classes. The cool breeze, the sound of birds while learning was fulfilling. So the thing I didn't talk about with the twins and saying we see the world mathematically from birth. The other thing that we also do is directly connect the mathematics that we're using to emotion. Okay, so the emotion is a part of being mathematical from birth. And so we need to make sure that we don't try and take the emotion away from mathematics. And Ambrosia, thank you for reminding me of that. So we need the cool breeze, the sound of birds while learning. We need space in our heads to be noticing that, because that allows us to learn, and it allows us to go back to that place where we were joyful learning with the cool breeze and the sound of birds. That's absolutely gorgeous. Math isn't locked in a box. My teacher makes it fun and brought it to life. Enjoyed learning about art, and then going outdoors to use the principles. This is lovely. Requiring hands-on activities around the school. Yeah, Alison, that's great. A jingle to be able to write numerals. I enjoyed it when we were able to discuss and give our ideas. That's back to the emotion, but we only learn when we're talking through things, don't we? I was really disappointed in my 14-year-old grandson's school. In fact, he's disappointed in it and will probably try and get into a different school. They have examinations every year when they don't need examinations. And when they're doing the examinations, so he's 14, when they've not got an exam, they sit in a room and they have to sit in silence revising. And I said, you know what, Felix, you can't revise if you're not talking to somebody about it. He said, "Oh no!" So the kids know. Drawing pictures, so bringing other skills in, lining up and saying multiplication tables outside. Hi, Kamara. it's worth having a flick back through all those statements, Kamara. That's been fantastic. Thank you, everybody, and thank you so much for sharing. And I hope you start to see the sorts of things that I'm getting at. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So I thought at some stage I better describe what mathematics is to me. And I created this, and I do actually have this written up on my, I'm in a little shed outside in the north of England. It's probably 1.5 meters by 2 meters at most. Okay. And it's quite hot in here now. I've got the door open. It's a beautiful day out there. Helen has taken the grandchildren out. I've banned Tanda from playing Call of Duty because it would take up too much broad bandwidth. And in this shed, I looked at, it's the New Zealand curriculum, the International Baccalaureate, which is something that I work with quite a lot, which is taught around the world, the UK curriculum, a curriculum called Reggio Emilia, which is an early years curriculum. I think one of the things that we teachers who don't teach kids in the early years can learn from is the early years approach to teaching, which certainly is joyful. And then my experience over more years than I care to measure of teaching. We use mathematics to explore and explain the worlds we live in. We don't just live in one world. We know we live in different worlds. I've already shared some of my worlds at the beginning, and even things like I'm called Ant at home and Tony when I write books, and sharing that with Ant Wayne. I'm going to call him Ant with Ant in Jamaica. So the more confident we are in our mathematics, the more confident we can be in exploring and explaining the different worlds that we live in. And that these worlds are social worlds, political worlds, and creative worlds, maybe other worlds as well. I think one of the ways that we create our identity, and I think mathematics can be quite bound up with identity, is through the stories that we tell ourselves. And the way we create our mathematical identity is the stories we tell ourselves about us and our mathematics, which is part of the purpose of me asking you to write those stories, little stories in the chat. Okay, because they're stories we can tell ourselves about us as mathematicians. And if those stories are joyful, then we will be joyful when we're teaching mathematics. And if what we're doing as teachers is creating stories like this for our students, so if we can create joyful stories about teaching mathematics, they will have the same way that you've got them in your heads there. They will carry those with them, so that when in 20 years' time, they go on a webinar and somebody asks them to write down about a memorable moment, they'll say, "Oh, I remember that time in school when I had to learn concepts outside using all sorts of different hands-on activities." Those are the things they'll remember. And we apply mathematics both in the real worlds that we exist in, and when we're being creative, and in our imaginary worlds that we have. And even grown-ups have imaginary worlds, or maybe worlds that we would like to create. And then maybe in terms of what it is, the exploration of relationships between numbers or shapes. I'm going to add patterns to that now after our previous conversation. Classifying and generalizing. So noticing things, noticing that all these shapes with 3 straight lines seem to be called triangles. That's classifying and then generalizing. Noticing that when we cry because we've got this funny pain in our tummies, a grown-up human being goes away and brings back a bottle. That's generalizing. That's algebra. That's very early algebra. It's also early solving problems. How can I take away this funny feeling in my tummy? Oh, that seems to work. I'll do that again. And something that I think is really important, not seeing mathematics as something that we ever finish, and that's not a problem. Okay, because the joy in mathematics is exploring things, is noticing things and exploring them, not in getting the right answer, there can be a joy in being successful and somebody saying well done, but actually the joy and the confidence comes through exploring the mathematics and noticing what happens when we explore the mathematics. Tate said to me last night, he said, can you make a square with 3 lines? And so I looked at him and I said, well, no. And he said, you can. I said, you can't. It'd be a triangle. And he said, you can. And he drew a square on a piece of paper and put 3 lines inside. And he said, there you are, a square with 3 lines. And then he said, sometimes I'm smarter than grown-ups. And I thought, you know what, Tate, sometimes you are. And I like that confidence. There's a confidence there, isn't there, about his mathematics. So what the next 6 slides do are kind of unpick the social, political, or creative a little bit. And what I will do over the next 6 slides is link it back to Max Maths. So what I didn't say at the beginning was that I'm the author of the Max Maths materials that are recently out in Jamaica, and that's kind of what the recent tour Kingston Bookshop came around, and we were working on the Max Maths series. I also wrote the Explore Maths series, which is for the higher grades, but today I'm focusing on the Max Maths. So the next slide, please, Alice. So thinking about mathematics in our social worlds as one way of mathematics being relevant. And maybe just two examples. We very deliberately have used avatars. So those 6 little characters at the bottom. I'm just looking at what Sinead's saying. Yep. And it's another example of how the real world can impose itself on mathematics, and that we must let it. So when we talk about cricket, we can find ways of bringing mathematics in and enjoy doing that, not feel guilty about doing that, enjoy doing that. And I think one of the things that I try to do when I'm writing is allow those stories to come into the writing. So avatars, little characters that engage in the mathematics throughout all of the books, are saying hi at the beginning of the books, and so that the students see themselves in the mathematics. And that's a way of mathematics being a part of their social world. So these little characters can be a part of those social worlds. Jenny said earlier on, I enjoyed it when we were able to discuss and give our ideas. And part of the point of having these avatars is they hopefully encourage discussion, because they quite often in the pages of the books, they're making comments. You'll see some of those later on. And hopefully all of the students in Jamaica can see themselves within a character. I remember one of the very earliest series that I wrote was a series in the UK for an American publisher called Harcourt Brace Jovanovic. And we were very careful with the images that we were using in the books. And I was working at the time in a primary school, which was very, very multicultural. And I noticed one day that a young lad called Amit was doing the same page again and again and again in the maths textbook. And I said, Amit, what? You've done this? You did this yesterday. I kind of didn't mind too much because it was an investigation, so he could find out different things. He was learning things while he did it. And he said, yeah, but Tony, it's my page. And I looked, and the page said, Amit is exploring the patterns that you get in triangular numbers. And Amit hadn't seen himself in a maths book before. And suddenly there he was. And he just wanted to do that page again and again and again. So that was relevant to him because he could see himself in the mathematics. Triangle numbers aren't necessarily directly relevant to real life, but that point they became directly relevant to Amit. Deliberately used a very early page. Kids count. Kids love counting. Honestly, they really love counting. And there's just so much stuff you can count around the classroom, at home. So getting them into the habit of counting And hopefully that's both relevant and enjoyable and social. It's a way of engaging socially. And I said to those that came to the face-to-face, you'll notice there that there are 3 different ways of showing each number. And hopefully pages like that encourage you to literally touch things and count things. Next page, please, Alice. Thinking about the 5. So not just presenting 5 as a line of dots. You can see there that that's Tate when he was very much younger, and he's creating that display about 5 and all the different ways he can arrange 5. So he's getting a real sense of 5. I've noticed he signed that at the top. You can just see the TE at the top of it that he signed, and he just did a piece of artwork this morning, and he signed that and put it on our wall. So doesn't feel directly relevant to real life, but that's obviously relevant to Tate's lived experience, and it's social because the mathematics is in the world that he lives in outside the classroom. Next one, please, Alice. So 2 pages from Max Maths. Every unit, every different mathematical topic ends in a real world example. So that's one way of it being directly relevant. But I'm also going to claim that those sorts of things are imaginary, because if we make a shop in our classroom, we are acting things out, and we can try the mathematics out in an imaginary situation. And we can make up prices, or we could use real prices. We could research the real prices. So there's creating shops when we've been working on money. And one of the things that the books encourage you to do is actually do that. And I think that might be something that people would remember later. I remember when we made a shop in our classroom. One of the most useful mathematical activities probably I engaged in with kids was when my daughter Holly was at her primary school, and we created a snack shop in the school, and the 11-year-olds in the school ran this shop. So they did all the ordering for food, they decided how much to charge, they ran it as a little business to raise money for playground equipment. That's certainly real world mathematics. And then another page where we're asking students to design board games. And you'll notice it's not just designing a board game. Make sure that the game is fair. Make a spinner that is fair. So there's probability being included in that. So there's something there about imaginary worlds. The next slide, please. 2 examples from, and this is both Felix when he was younger. The left-hand one is in a coffee shop. I always have a box of Cuisinaire in my bag that I carry around. Box of Cuisinaire and the game Uno. And Felix there had taken a truck, and he was asking how many bales of hay can I fit in the farmer's truck, was his question, and that was one of his solutions. So certainly the enjoyment was in exploring the task. We have shapes called polydron that Felix would make. And there's 2 football stadiums. He's creating the World Cup, and there are 2 football stadiums and 3 hotels. But he talked in detail about what the stadium was being used for, about who was staying in the hotel. So he was creating a whole imaginary world there, and telling stories, using mathematics to tell stories. Next one, please. And then there are mathematical worlds. This is one that I was going to get you to do, but I'm sorry, I've talked too much and not let you have enough say. An hour is never enough for me. I'm going to come to Kimua in a minute. I've just noticed that. So those are mathematical worlds. There's no attempt there to say this is real life, but I think it's fascinating, and therefore it can be relevant to my lived experience. Okay, and that we all might see different number sentences in the images on the left. there's something fascinating about the way triangle numbers are formed. And you may or may not be noticing that if I add consecutive triangle numbers, I get square numbers. I wonder why that might be. If we had more time, I would tell you, but I'll just leave that hanging there. And a maths question, write down 3 things that you notice about triangular numbers, and the students will be talking about that, and then maybe we'd all have a conversation about things that we notice. So that's certainly not just about getting things right or wrong. So there's a relevance and a joy in mathematical worlds. Next slide, please. Again, I think if we make maths relevant in mathematical worlds in the classroom, then that can transfer to outside the classroom. Tate and Quinn there about 6 months ago, and there's a museum in Leeds, which is the nearest city to me, and they're exploring mathematics in that museum. Tanda, who's with them, is grinning. He's partly grinning because he kept saying they just know more mathematics than I do. But I think there's an enjoyment in his face, maybe in watching them applying their mathematics in their mathematical worlds. And on the right-hand side, there was a workshop with teachers in Belize, and they were just creating images around numbers and being as imaginative as they could with the images that they created, which showed particular numbers. And in that, so they were both in a creative world and in a mathematical world at that point. Next story, please. And just the thing that stayed with me around joy in learning, and I'm kind of reminded of, and I'm being reminded of again with seeing very young children, is when we're young, we don't worry about not knowing things. In fact, we kind of like not knowing stuff because it means there's stuff to learn and we're excited about the possibilities. So, Quinn, first day at school, last September. He's not learnt anything at school yet, but look at the joy in that face. I'm going to learn so much stuff. And he comes home skipping, as does Tate. There's a much longer story around that image, but just focus on that smile and that. And he's learned all sorts of things about ordering 2-digit numbers and a game. He's also applied that in his real life in other ways. Hi, Lisa. Thanks for the greetings. But that grin, not finished learning everything. In fact, I'll just tell you one little bit. So we were playing that game, which was about numbers up to 100. And it's taken quite a long time. The next day, he's working on the side there. That's his kitchen at home. And his dad's making pancakes. His dad's a chef. Mathematics directly relevant to being a chef. And weighing things out. And his dad said, we need 120 grams of flour. Now, Tate's only done numbers up to 100, right? He can't count to 100. He can order numbers up to 100. Well, that's kind of where we got. He didn't say anything about this 120. And again, that's reveling in ignorance. There's so much stuff we don't know that adults say. We don't expect to understand everything that adults say. As he was measuring it out, he was counting the numbers that he recognized. So 80, 89, 95, 98. And then he stopped. And then his dad, Ben, stopped. And Tate said, well, what's that? And Ben said, that's 120. And I guess Tate would notice the 20 and maybe even notice it was a 3-digit number because he noticed things like that. And that 300 was a 3-digit number. And what he did was he turned around to me. I was sitting at that kitchen table. And he said, Grandad, there's numbers bigger than 100. Not getting at me for not having taught him that yet. Not embarrassed about not knowing it yet, but excited. There's more numbers to learn about. That's kind of the joy in learning. Right, I'm going to whiz through the next slides. We've got 6 minutes, but I hope you're getting the gist of all of this and maybe how I've tried to put it in the books. So I think well-being and joy go together. I talked about the UK not being best in terms of well-being of children and teachers in terms of school. And UNICEF, the United Nations charity, talk about well-being being taking care of the body, taking care of the mind, taking care of relationships, and taking care of the self and the world. Isn't that a good curriculum, we might think? And then the following sentence is my interpretation in terms of mathematics. And again, I've used this to help me when I'm putting together books. So being active and physical in mathematics is about taking care of the body. Becoming confident and resilient is about taking care of the mind. Collaborating and communicating is developing and taking care of relationships. And taking care of the self and the world is relating mathematics to our own experience and to our real worlds so that we can change those real worlds. Next slide, please. So just some examples of each of those. Taking care of the body. How many star jumps can you do in a minute? What else takes about a minute? What takes about an hour? What takes about a day? Outside, images of kids learning outside. Somebody said remembering the learning outside. Even Anne-Marie, and thinking about being outside, saying times table before going inside. Cricket outside. Next slide. Taking care of the mind. Open-ended mathematical activities and children as problem posers, I think, is one way of kids becoming confident and becoming resilient. So the mathematics doesn't exist in the teacher's head, the mathematics exists in the student's head and in the student's real world. So there are activities throughout Max Maths called Heads Together, where we expect the kids to be working in groups. So just images there, and what addition and subtraction number problem can you write down using this picture? Try and include zeros in your problems, and share those problems with each other, and teach each other about how to solve your problems. While I'm thinking about mathematics being a bit more open, I've already talked about mathematics not finishing. Kimuya, when I struggle to work out a problem, I go to sleep and dream about the solution and wake up able to solve the problem. So not worrying if at the end of a mathematics lesson we've not solved everything, maybe saying to the kids, oh, we'll come back to that in the morning. Because they may, you never know, they may dream about it overnight and come back and carry on working on it. Next slide, please. Taking care of relationships. Again, working in groups, working outside, making tiles, all around. Let's learn together. And you can see there we've got the avatars engaged. I can say my name 10 times in 6 seconds. I can run from my house to school in 7 minutes. I sleep for 10 hours, and so on. So you can see within that activity what we're expecting is lots of discussion about our real lives and about how we use time to structure our real lives. And then on the next page about our creative lives. And then the 2 more slides, the final slides. So, and this isn't meant to be a downer. Okay, one of the things that all of the teachers that I was talking to when I was with you in Jamaica in February was we need to do something. And when I went and looked at the international comparisons when I came home, I think we need to do something. So this, 2 things. One, that we is me, both in the UK and internationally, because this problem that I'm talking about today is a problem globally. But there's something here that is particular to Jamaica. So the sense of belonging among students in school is low. Students' life satisfaction is low. PISA is the international comparisons. Maybe something that is even more worrying than that is the share of students who disagreed your intelligence is something about you that you can't change very much is among the smallest. Okay, So, because what we would like is our students to become confident, isn't it? And think, no, I can change. I can be different. And I hope that the sorts of things we've been talking about, or I've been talking about, would allow students to say, you know what? I can change the way that maybe my parents feel about mathematics. It's not like that. Maybe they can be like too and say, I'm better than that at maths. That doesn't measure me at maths. I can change. And that I can, the fourth comment is the same. Intelligence isn't something that's fixed. I can do well at mathematics. I can become confident in mathematics, and you will support them in doing that by working on all of the things that we've been talking about. So finally, last slide, please, Alice. And you have got plenty of examples of that in Jamaica. And I talked about going back to my reggae roots. I was 18 in 76, 77, which was when Bob Marley first came over to the UK. It was just after the attempt on his life. He came over to the UK for a bit of respite, I think. And one of my favourite Bob Marley songs is Redemption Song, in which he uses that Marcus Garvey quotation. Going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, no one but ourselves can free the mind. Mind is your only ruler, sovereign. I hope that's what we've been talking about. Confidence, enjoyment, resilience through mathematics, allowing us to change our world through our engagement with mathematics. If you haven't confidence in self, you're twice defeated in the race of life. With confidence, you've won even before you've started. And it's down to us to develop that confidence. And I think we can do that through mathematics with our students, all the students that we work with. So thank you. Thank you so much for engaging. Sorry, I've gone 2 minutes over, but we got to Marcus Garvey in the end.
Thank you very much, Tony. That was great. I hope everyone found that really, really interesting and lots of takeaways from that as well. So just to quickly remind everyone, look out for your emails. You'll have a link to your certificate that you can download, and also the slides that Tony's gone through today, as well as a survey, the post-webinar survey. Any teachers that you've got, colleagues that were registered but weren't able to attend, they should look out on their emails too, because there's a link where they can register to watch the recording. So thank you again, Tony, and hopefully everyone has a lovely rest of the day and a great break as well.
Yeah, enjoy teaching.
Yeah,
I think you're teaching for the rest of the day. And thanks for your lovely comments. And I hope to see some of you in person in the future.
Great. We'll end the webinar now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.